Today I'm talking about Paul Cézanne, the artist who probably did the most towards the development of modern art. Let me give you a quote from Picasso. Cezanne was the father of us all. He was the only master for me. He was the father figure to us. It was he who offered us protection. And by protection, he meant that it was Cezanne who broke the mould, who enabled later artists to break with past conventions. Another quote is from Matisse. Henri Matisse said, "A kind of dear God of painting." And that debt that he felt towards Cezanne lasted all of his life. In his 80s, he said that he believed that he owed the most to the art of Cezanne. One way of understanding Cezanne's work is to see him as a breaker of conventions, conventions regarding perspective, colour, appearance, and so on. And another way of looking at his work is to see that he's someone who combines a naturalistic, not abstract, a naturalistic representation combined with a personal expression, but with the abstract use of paint. I'll explain and unravel more of that later. He was notoriously slow. He would require something like 150 sittings to paint a portrait. It's said that he could take 10 minutes, some people say an hour, to put on a single touch of paint. Yet he was a prolific artist. He produced something like 1,300 paintings, oil and watercolour, through his lifetime. And from that massive output, I've had to select just 40 to represent his art. So let's start at the beginning. This self-portrait he produced in his early years. He was about 24 years old. He's painted a dark, brooding person. He wasn't a very unusual person. I'll talk a bit about his personality. He was shy, impulsive, awkward. He didn't like mixing. He felt like an outsider. He felt like an unrefined provincial with his strong Provençal accent in the sophisticated world of Paris. He found it difficult meeting new people, although people who got to know him seemed to like him, although he did have a temper, and he could switch from being polite to anger without warning and for no apparent reason. But there's a few aspects of his personality that I'd like to describe because they're worth mentioning. He was afraid of being touched, and he put that down to being kicked from behind when he was a child by a boy who was sliding down a banisters next to him. Although that doesn't, to me, seem sufficient to explain his fear. And just to highlight that fear, he was out walking with a friend, Émile Bernard, and Cezanne stumbled and Bernard put out his hand to steady him. Cezanne immediately became angry and shouted, "No one dares to touch me. I won't let anybody get his hooks into me. Never, never." In fact, he later had to apologise. And I think the word hooks is interesting, as he didn't want to be restricted in his art by any existing style or technique. And it seems he didn't want to be restricted in his life in any way. He wanted to be a free force. Secondly, he was an extremely shy with women, to the extent that he appears to have a fear of women. In fact, one biographer believes it was rooted in an uncontrollable lust for women. So rather than use nude models, he would turn to books with their poor reproductions or rough sketches he'd made from art galleries, or the drawings of nude figures that we'll see in a moment that he made when he was a student. He was also finally given, as I've mentioned, to sudden angry outbursts. And one of the things that gave rise to that is praise. He had few supporters in his lifetime and distrusted praise. And if praised, he might scream, laugh, or break down in tears. He might thank the person, but then suddenly turn on them and violently accuse them of flattery. But he was also, at times, humble. So on one occasion, Auguste Rodin shook his hand when they met, and later in the day, Cezanne knelt in the middle of a dusty road to thank him for the handshake. He wasn't being sarcastic or obsequious. He was, I believe, honestly grateful that Rodin had admired his work. This is what I mentioned about one of his student drawings. He could draw nudes. He had a conventional art training at art school. And in fact, at art school, he won second prize in a figure study, not this one, a figure study. But let's begin at the beginning. He was born in Aix-en-Provence. He was the son of a milliner, a hat maker, but his father later became a successful and wealthy banker. His parents married some 5 years after he was born, and he had 2 younger sisters. His mother supported him, but his father and his sisters were dismissive of his work. And his father later, as I'll explain, gave him a meagre allowance until his father died, when Cezanne inherited a substantial, one might say a vast fortune that gave him financial security for the rest of his life. Now, going back to Aix, when he was 10, he went to the St. Joseph School, and when he was 13, to what was called the College Bourbon, and there he met Émile Zola, the novelist, who became his friend. And together with another boy that they met, they became known as the Three Inseparables, and together they would read Homer and Virgil and discuss art. They would walk in the countryside, spend long days together reading poetry, swimming and bathing, significant in his later work, and relaxing and drying in the hot sun. So happy, carefree days that were to have I think a lasting influence on his work. He was there about 6 years. When he was at the college, he wrote poetry in Latin, which Zola greatly admired and thought he should become a poet. But Cezanne wasn't that interested, regarded it as a hobby. So in 1857, he attended the École Gratuite des Arts, the free municipal school of drawing in Aix, where he studied art and where he did figure studies. Throughout his life, he was indecisive, unsure of himself. And Zola, who was completely different, after his father had died, went to Paris to seek his fortune and wrote many letters to Cezanne, encouraging him to come to Paris. In fact, he said he thought that Cezanne lacked the strength of character to stand up to his father, and he urged him to break away from his home and come to Paris. His father wanted him to take over from him in the bank. He wanted him to become a banker and insisted that he enrolled in the law faculty in the University of Aix, which he did in 1859. That's 2 years after he would attended the School of Drawing. And he went to the law faculty and studied jurisprudence. However, he did fairly well in his first year, but he lost interest and spent most of his time painting and drawing. His father saw that he wasn't that interested, and so maybe to test him out, the the same year that Cezanne started at the university, his father bought an estate, the Jar de Buffon, or the House of the Wind, a big estate. It was formerly owned by the governor of Provence, but it was run down, and his father agreed or asked Cezanne to paint 4 murals in the drawing room, which we see here. They don't, of course, look like later Cezanne, but I thought it was a good place to start. He painted them when he was 21. The 2 that he painted first are this one summer and this one winter. And the latter 2, spring and autumn, you can see how his technique improved while he was painting. Interestingly, if you look down the bottom, each painting here, down the bottom, is signed Ingres. Interesting, because Ingres, a well-known, famous neoclassical painter, he intensely disliked his work. So signing it Ingres may have been amusing or derisive, or maybe a statement to his father. Maybe he was saying to his father, this is the way I know you like painting to be done, in the style of Ingres, but it's not the way that I wish to paint. I guess the father was testing his son's skill, which at this point was, what should we say, satisfactory, and Cezanne needed to prove himself to his father. Another painting he did around this time, and a painting which we perhaps would recognise as Cezanne. This was painted in what's known as his dark period, 1861, when he started to paint, to 1870. And the reasons it's called the dark period will become more obvious later. I just wanted to show you this part of the Jar de Buffon, the estate his father bought, or which he often painted, the house and the estate. And it was in 1861, encouraged by his father and against his father's wishes at that stage, that he left for Paris to pursue a career in art. There he met Camille Pissarro, later a great influence on him, Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, but he still felt like an outsider. In fact, he wrote, "I'm wasting my time in every respect." And Zola wrote in a letter to a friend, "How strange a fellow he was. No sooner had he arrived in Paris than he wanted to go home." And in fact, he did go home. And he actually travelled backwards and forwards. He never settled. He travelled backwards and forwards between Paris and Aix, not really feeling comfortable in either location. He didn't get on with his family, although, as I said, his mother encouraged him. He hated his father and his sisters. He called them the nastiest people in the world. Now, because of his unconventional style, he was turned down by the École des Beaux-Arts, and instead he attended the Académie Suisse, which in fact is where he met a number of the artists who are now known as famous Impressionists. He copied work in the Louvre with Camille Pissarro, and shortly afterwards he returned to Aix and actually started work in his father's bank. But no sooner had he started in the bank than he wanted to go back to Paris. It was at this point that I think his father accepted the inevitable, that he'd never become a banker, gave him a very small allowance, but it did enable him to return and live in Paris. He lived on this small allowance, in fact, until he was 47 in 1886, when his father died and left him 400,000 francs. Now, on returning to Paris, he applied to the École des Beaux-Arts again and was turned down again. It was, incidentally, the School of Fine Art was the leading art school in Paris and was regarded as essential training for anyone who wished to become successful as a, what should we say, a conventional artist. It was also about this time that he made his first submission to the Salon, the annual Salon de Paris, and his work was rejected along with works by Manet, Pissarro, Monet and so on. And there was a public outcry because 2/3 of the paintings submitted had been rejected. And so Napoleon III, who was a very conservative in his love of art, but he was very sensitive to public opinion, so he created a Salon de Refusés, or exhibition of rejects, where Cezanne was exhibited together with all the other rejected artists. But the people who visited, and many thousands a day visited, but to mock and laugh and make fun of the paintings. And in fact, the main Salon continued to reject his work. Cezanne continued to submit it for the next 19 years. It was eventually accepted, but only because a friend of his had gone onto the jury, and jurors were allowed to submit one work of their students, and so he said that Cezanne was a student of his, which he wasn't, and Cezanne's work was accepted and displayed in the Salon de Paris, but he was then 43. Let's go back to his early life. Again in 1865, when he was 26, by then he returned to Aix and painted a series of portraits. This is of his father. Perhaps he's best known. It's called The Artist's Father Reading L'Événement. The L'Événement was a liberal painter which his father would never have read. And in fact, it's a newspaper that had just employed Émile Zola as an art critic. Now, we don't know why he's shown him reading this paper. You'll notice as well that his father, the floor is sort of tilted. His father is sliding towards us. There's a painting by Cezanne on the wall at the back. It's some sort of joke, ironic comment, some sort of statement of the relationship he had with his father. I don't know what his father thought of the painting. But Cezanne continued to shuffle between Aix and Paris. 1867 in Paris, 68 in Aix, 69 back in Paris. And in fact, in 1869, he met Marie-Hortense Fiquet. She worked as a bookbinder's assistant, but she also worked as a part-time model at Académie Suisse, where Cezanne was a student. And that's how they met. She was 19, he was 30. They started a relationship, but he was worried about his father finding out and cutting off his allowance, which I think his father would have done. So he didn't tell his father. Let me talk a little bit more about this painting in the context of the art of the time, because it's interesting in the technique that Cezanne has used. He's using a palette knife, and this is a technique he copied from Gustave Courbet, who was a strong influence on his work at this time. but I need to explain all of the different art movements that were impacting on artists in the 1860s. Starting with Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, the artist that Cezanne despised. This is one of his famous works, Napoleon I on his imperial throne, and you can immediately see this sort of style that Cezanne assumed his father would like, conservative, what's called neoclassical. And Ingres believed that one artists should, and he taught artists or students to base their work on very detailed drawings that were then effectively coloured in. He didn't see that colour was important. He thought that the key to art was a very detailed drawing, and that the subjects that should be painted, the grand subjects, were mythological or famous historical figures. Landscapes and still lifes were considered a lower form of art. Then, in the second quarter of the century, this was painted in 1806, we have the Romantic artists like Eugène Delacroix, who challenged this approach. Romanticism regarded colour as more important than line, and artists' sensibilities as more important than conventions and mythology. And as a result, the art world split in two between the neoclassicists and the romanticists, and the debate between them, or the argument between them, became popular in the popular press would write about these two competing schools. It even became the subject of cartoons. And then Courbet came along. This is A Burial at Ornans, a very, as you can see, a very large painting, over 3 meters long. Over 6 meters long and 3 meters high. Why do I mention the dimensions? Well, it's because the only paintings that were large in the grand tradition were history paintings, historical or mythological subjects. And what Courbet has done here, he's painted a large painting of an ordinary, everyday funeral. It was described by one historian as like an upstart in dirty boots crashing a genteel party. Initially rejected by the public, but Courbet was a character. Eventually the public became interested in this new, what's called realist approach. And in due course, neoclassicism became seen as old-fashioned, and the fantasies of romanticism began to lose their popularity. What Courbet said later is Burial at Ornans, this painting, was in reality the burial of romanticism. So Courbet became, in due course, a celebrity, regarded, and he was a character. He was spoken of as a genius, a socialist, a savage. And he encouraged the press to present him in this way, as an unconventional character. And he became, through this approach, a notorious and well-known character in the art world. So all this is to explain the various influences on Cezanne in the 1860s, and the people, mostly students working with him at the time, who became the Impressionists, another influence. So it's Courbet who often used the coarse strokes of a palette knife. And here we see Cezanne using that technique again, and this is one of 9 portraits of his maternal uncle, Dominique Aubert, a farmer in Provence. And we see here Cezanne struggling to find a style. It's influenced partly by the Romantics. You can see the red, the note, the dash of red in the middle as his cravat, as Delacroix always had a dash of red. It's influenced partly by the Impressionists, although I'm not sure we'd describe it as an Impressionist painting, and partly by Courbet, the realists. He described it, Cezanne described it as gutsy, with this coarse application of paint, although there is an attention to detail in the way he's captured the texture of the clothing and the folds of the skin. A slightly darker painting, remember we're in his dark period. And maybe I should translate more accurately. I said gutsy. Cezanne actually called these paintings manière cuillard, which literally, I guess a better translation would be that they were ballsy. And inspired, as I said, by Courbet. Courbet, though, didn't always paint in the way that we've just seen. This is another painting by Courbet that he painted at the same time. He'd just painted the year previously. And it was a work that, although it was done as a private commission, it was a work that artists and Cezanne would probably have known about. You can see he's using smooth brushwork, but this painting is controversial in other obvious ways. And like Courbet, Cezanne is expressing sexual, but also I think here darker, deeper emotions. This work was a sort of a breakthrough. It's been seen as the invention of modern expressionism. But let me show you some other works of his dark period. It's it's called The Murder. Cezanne by this time was reaching the age of 30. And these dark themes do reflect the mood at the time. I don't want to make out that Cezanne was painting these in isolation, that it was a sort of just an expression of his personality. It was a reflection of the mood and culture of the time. You can see this if you read the novels of his friend Émile Zola, like Thérèse Raquin, where the heroine murders her husband. And you can see here there's a woman on the right holding down a woman who's being stabbed by an accomplice, the man on the left. It's reminiscent of a Spanish artist, Francisco Goya. This is Scene of Rape and Murder. Now you'll notice it was painted in 1808 to 12, but in the 1860s in France, Goya had reached the height of his popularity. So another influence on Cezanne was Goya's work, the novels that were being written, and Cezanne would go out of his way to find dark stories of rape and murder in the popular press, who made a point of publishing these sensational stories because people loved to read them. He was, by the way, as I mentioned, by this time living with Marie Hortense Fiquet. And then in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War started, and to avoid call-up, he fled with Hortense from Paris to a little village. It's about 10 kilometres from Marseille and only about 20 kilometres from Aix on the coast, called L'Estaque. And there he painted landscapes. They found out that he was a deserter. He'd fled. They brought a criminal charge against him, but then the war ended. It only lasted from July 1870 to January 1871, and the case against him was dropped or forgotten, and so he returned to Paris. The following year, they had a child, Paul, and who lived. In fact, Paul lived until 1947, and still his father, Cezanne's father, knew nothing of the relationship or of the birth of Paul. His mother knew, but she kept it secret from her father and her daughters. And they were both frightened he would cut off the allowance, which I think was, some people say 100 francs. I think it was 150 francs a month. And he had no other income because he wasn't selling many or any of his paintings. Another painting of the dark period, this is called The Abduction, or sometimes it's called The Rape. And maybe it's mythological. It's been suggested it might be Hercules abducting Alcestis, who in fact he'd rescued from the underworld. Or some people believe it's the abduction of Proserpina by Pluto, both from Ovid's Metamorphosis. But another one of the typical works of the dark period, another one is this painting, sometimes called The Autopsy, but I think it's not an autopsy. I think it's more correctly called Preparation for the Funeral. And that's the title I've used here. And I think it probably reflects, I haven't mentioned this up to now, but Cezanne, all of his life, was a devout Catholic. And I think this is a depiction of the dead Christ, because religion did influence a lot of his work. In fact, he said, I've got a quote here, hold on. "When I judge art, I take my painting and put it next to a God-made object, like a tree or a flower. If it clashes, it's not art." And in fact, later in life, he became a fervent Catholic. It's interesting to compare this. I've got a study he made in preparation for this work, this drawing he made, a life drawing. And you can see the way that he's altered it. In other words, he retained his skill at life drawing, but it wasn't what he thought was appropriate for what he wanted to produce. Notice the way that the arm of the nude figure in the painting that could be Christ has been extended almost down to the knee, but the realistic drawing shows where the hand would come on a person. So the painting has been intentionally, the body's been intentionally distorted for effect, to make a stronger statement. Another one of his dark paintings, influenced by Manet in this case. I'll show you the painting that influenced it in a moment. It's called Pastoral. Naked bodies, 3 naked women and 3 clothed men on, maybe it's a lake, but it looks like a seashore. Opposite there's what could be an island. There's a phallic symbol on top of the island. reflected in the water and almost entering a bottle on the shoreline. At this stage, Cezanne did often include phallic emblems or symbols in his painting. On the right, there's a man in a boat smoking. But let me show you the painting that I think influenced this. I said it was Manet. It's Luncheon on the Grass, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And it's you can see there the naked woman with the clothed men, but they're in a wood in that case. There's a lot of elements, some of them difficult to see in this, but there's a luncheon strewn on the grass. It was, well, I was going to say controversial. It was a bit stronger than that. It scandalised the Parisian art world in 1863 when it was shown. I think because of the juxtaposition of a naked woman and a clothed man. As I said, Cezanne had an unusual, shall we say, relationship with women. He frequently painted nude women, but seldom used nude models. He said to Renoir, "I paint still lifes. Women models frighten me." So I think we should see it that way, not as an interpretation or an inspiration from the Manet. It's not following Manet in any way. Another painting, this time a still life, called The Black Marble Clock. He was, by the way, struggling at this stage financially. He'd been rejected again by the Salon. It's a still life. It's unusual. I'm leaving a little bit of time for you to look at it more closely. There's a clock that doesn't... It's difficult. I mean, is it a large clock? Is it a table clock? What's it resting on? Is it resting on that dark blue coloured thing in the background? I'm struggling to find a name for it. There's two pink vases on top. There's a vase on the table in front of us. There's a lot of folded tablecloth, I assume. We can just see a lemon. The clock has no hands. And there's this enormous shell with this bright red opening. Surely it has sexual overtones. The painting that it's been compared with is again Manet, his Olympia. You might at first think, what? How does that compare? It's the tablecloth compared with the sheets. It's the red of the shell compared with the red orchid behind her ear. It's the dark clock compared with the dark figure, and the face of the clock is a bit, one can imagine, is a bit like the paper surrounding the bouquet. You might think I'm stretching things, but let me show you another painting Cezanne painted at this time. He's actually called it a modern Olympia. So he was well aware, influenced by, and was interested in Manet's painting of Olympia. His painting, of course, of Olympia is completely different. He's the woman's relaxing on the bed. She's not sitting upright, looking directly at us. And in this case, he's painted a figure looking at the woman. Looks like a portrait of Cezanne himself. Another painting influenced by Olympia, a typical erotic fantasy of this period, set, it's called Afternoon in Naples. It was a title suggested by a friend of his, And Italy was seen in France at this time as a place of freedom, of sensual life and gaiety, although I'm not sure that's exactly what's reflected in this painting. As I said, inspired by Olympia, but again very different from Olympia. There's two figures on the bed. The woman has a very different pose. She's facing away from us, unlike Manet's woman and her direct gaze. The eternal feminine, in this case, men are gathered around a single female figure, seem to be talking about her. There's a bishop, musicians, writers, lawyers. Possibly down the bottom in the middle, a portrait of Cezanne himself. She has a blank face, in fact a face that's been blanked out, and so maybe represents the role of women as seen by men, such as the Virgin Mary or a saint or Venus. It has been compared to Courbet's painter's studio, this painting. Although Cezanne places the woman in the centre and Cezanne's woman, is unashamedly naked, whereas Courbet's is, in this case, demurely holding a sheet against her body. The Cezanne's what are called shyness with women lasted all of his life. He didn't get over it, and when he moved to Aix later, he stopped using female models completely, partly because of his discomfort with women, partly because of his prudish neighbours started complaining about the people and the women visiting his studio. So he stopped. This is a transitional piece. We've come to the end of the dark period, 1870. And here he's not painting from nature, unlike the Impressionists. He's actually illustrating or painting or inspired by a fashion plate. I couldn't find this exact one, but I think this is close enough. And this is from the Illustrated Journal of Ladies. And there were many such magazines. They're very popular. Zola was appalled. He said they resemble banal and unintelligent fashion plates, and their works should instead be alive. They should be taken from life. However, 6 years previously, Charles Baudelaire, in a very famous essay called The Painter of Modern Life, comments on the fashion plate, and he feels it represents the philosophy and thinking of the age in which it was produced, and that the fashion plate conveys a moral and aesthetic feeling about the culture, society and life of the period. So it's Baudelaire that's inspired Cezanne to produce this painting, although it's no longer a fashion plate. He's added two men, and I couldn't find any fashion plates with men in them. It wasn't typical of the fashion plates. So he's added a note of passion. In the background, you can see behind that bush, there's a phallic tower rising up with the tricolore, the French flag on top, maybe as a reference to the Franco-Prussian War that had just finished. And we now enter what's called his Impressionist period. And of the paintings of the Impressionist period, which was 1870 to 78, I think this is the most impressionist, the most influenced by, in fact, Pissarro. And it's regarded as a masterpiece of this period of his life. It's called The House of the Hanged Man, although it wasn't actually a hanged man, a man who'd hanged himself. in the house or any. It was related to the nickname Le Pendu, which means the hanged man, was the name of the man who lived there. So it was a sort of a joke. But coming back to the painting, you can see the rough brushstrokes is used, a different sort of style, a heavier style than the Impressionists. It hasn't got the lightness of the Impressionists. It's got more of a bold heaviness of Cezanne. Now at this stage, he was painting with, later Pissarro regarded Cezanne as his master, but at this stage, Cezanne described himself as Pissarro's pupil, and in fact called Pissarro God the Father. And he said, we all stem from Pissarro. And he very much took Pissarro's advice. He moved away from his dark style. He stopped using dark colours. He painted on Pissarro's advice using just a palette of yellow, red and blue and mixing the colours. Painted more landscapes based on Pissarro's advice. He felt, incidentally, that Pissarro was leading him in a direction that he felt comfortable with, that he wanted to be led in. So he felt he was learning from Pissarro to do some things that brought out what he wanted to achieve. The surface, as I said, was, some of the other Impressionists like Monet and Manet described it as laid on with a trowel, granular and dense, I think we would say. It's painted in Auvers-sur-Oise, and it's it was one of three that was exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition, 1874, and it was one of the few paintings at the exhibition that was bought. It was bought by a collector, Count Doria, for 300 francs. And it was one of the few sold at the exhibition. His fellow Impressionist painters nicknamed Cezanne Le Pendu, the hanged man, because of his success in selling this painting. He exhibited it several times in his lifetime later at other exhibitions, which suggests he was happy with the work, he liked the work. This, in fact, was unusual. He was a perfectionist and was rarely happy with any of his work and destroyed many paintings or threw them out of the window. This is a self-portrait painted in 1875 when he was 36 and balding by that age, looking at us with a serious expression, maybe like a troubled artist in deep thought. Lively brushwork, colours, the colours of the background may be influenced by the Impressionists, but overall it's more the dark palette of the realists like Courbet, more of a subjective feeling of the Romantics. As I said, he introduced that personal, subjective, emotional into his paintings. And it was this year, he painted this, 1875, that he met the customs inspector and art collector, Victor Chouquet, who bought 3 of his works and became one of his most loyal collectors. And so from this point on, the few sales he made provided some financial relief from the paltry allowance that his father gave him. He left northern France, where he was working alongside Pissarro, as we've just seen, returned to his native south, back to L'Estaque, the fishing village near Marseille, working outdoors, immersing himself in the dazzling Mediterranean light, enhancing the colours more, flattening volumes. In fact, to give you a quote from Cezanne, he said, "It's like a playing card, red roofs against the blue sea." And like a playing card, he's flattened the scene. He didn't take part in the second Impressionist exhibition, but this was one of 16 works he submitted to the third Impressionist exhibition, which was, in fact, was the last one he attended. And he only just got in. The other Impressionists by this stage felt that his work was too unacceptable, and they voted against him coming in, but Pissarro persuaded them to allow him to attend the third Impressionist exhibition, but it was the last he attended. The Francois Zola Dam, we're entering the beginning of his mature period, 1878 to 90. A bit of background, maybe I'll give you a bit of background first to explain what's going on at this time. In 1878, his father finally found out about Hortense, Fiquet and their son Paul, and halved his allowance, which meant that he didn't have enough to live on, and he entered a difficult period, had to ask Zola for help, but relatively, I don't know how, but after a few months, I think, his father relented and increased his allowance to 400 francs a month. That's more than doubling his allowance. Still small, though. They didn't marry at that point, though. They didn't marry till 1886. And when they married in the presence of his parents. And by that stage, although they were in love when they were young, by 1886, when they finally married, they were no longer in love. The relationship had broken down, and he married to secure the future of his son Paul, who he deeply loved. And the year after they married, his father died. Cezanne, his mother and sisters inherited the estate, and it gave him an income of about 25,000 francs a month, and he lived in the substantial manor house into which he moved. Coming back to this work, though, I got a bit ahead of myself. As I said, it signifies the beginning of the mature period. He's breaking away from Impressionism. He's solidifying forms. He's eliminating perspective. He's very much balancing the composition. I'll show you later how he did that, what that meant. Mostly landscape, still life and figure paintings. Using dabs of paint, as you can see. And just to explain the name, Zola. Yes, it is connected with Émile Zola. Émile Zola's father, Francois Zola, was an engineer, and in fact they moved to Aix for him to construct this dam. And the dam still stands. So he was a successful engineer. But his father, sadly, didn't live to see the dam built. He was a better engineer than businessman, and when he died, he left substantial debts. And in fact, debtors came out of the woodwork. Debtors, I think, were making up debts to try and get money from his mother. She fended off the debtors, and her parents came to live with her to help her fend off the debt collectors. And Zola moved to Paris to make his fortune. Three Bathers. He painted many paintings of bathers in the latter stages of his life. This is one, not the earliest, this is one of the earliest three bathers. There's a natural pool. It's in the countryside. There's three women bathing. One has what looks like a towel. It's it's sunlit. One of the figures, the one on the right, is holding her hair in a way that is reminiscent of Titian. This painting I'm thinking of, Venus Rising from the Sea, in a painting in the National Gallery in Scotland. If you look at the way the figure is holding her hair, it's similar to the Cezanne. In fact, that reminds me, I should have perhaps have made the point earlier. What Cezanne was trying to achieve with his work is, he said something like, I want to make of Impressionism something solid and lasting, like the art in the museums. And so the old masters like Titian were very much an influence on his work. He wanted to combine their approach with, if you like, a more modern approach, but he wanted to create something that wasn't transient, wasn't an impression, but was solid and involved complex poses and balanced composition and a balance in colour and geometric forms. This painting, in fact, The Three Bathers, was bought by Henri Matisse. I've got another quote. This is Matisse. I have drawn from it my faith and my perseverance. He kept it for more than 30 years. He used it as an example when teaching his students, and he eventually donated it to where it is today, the Petit Palais. Right, about this time, between 1879 and 1880, he lived in Melun, which is about 30 miles southeast of Paris. Nearby, he painted this bridge, which is crossing a stream, which is a tributary of the Seine. There are no people in it. He's avoided telling a story. It's a tangle of geometric shapes, and it's constructed from rectangular brushstrokes which tie the painting together, but it's not exactly, he's not attempting to replicate foliage. He's suggesting the foliage of trees with this mosaic method of brushstrokes. So it's a breakaway from Impressionism. He's starting to leave that behind. And around about this time, there was another quote which is much re-quoted. May I repeat what I told you here, he wrote in a letter. Treat nature by means of the cylinder, the sphere, the cone. This was later regarded as a license to break down nature by the Cubists into cylinders and spheres and cones, but I don't think that's what he meant. You won't exactly find cylinders, spheres and cones in his work. It's something that he saw within nature. He saw it as the basic forms of nature, but he's balanced that with a representational style. As I said at the beginning, it's representational, it's his personal feeling and this abstract use of paint. This is his wife, Marie Hortense Fiquet Cezanne, the person he portrayed most often, in fact, 26 portraits. She was very good at sitting motionless. He hated people to move when he was painting them. On one occasion, he was painting Émile Zola's wife, and she laughed at a joke someone else in the room told, and that was it. He abandoned the portrait, said he wouldn't paint her, that she didn't know how to sit for a portrait. He just stopped painting her. Their relationship had broken down at this point, and to try and save the relationship, he took her to Switzerland at this point with Paul, but it didn't work. They couldn't repair their relationship. He thought she didn't take any interest in his work, didn't understand his work, and he found her fickle and shallow. At one stage he wrote, "My wife only cares for Switzerland and lemonade." But certainly when she was sitting for him, she knew how to sit still and perform, if you like, in the way he wished her to perform. After they were married, they lived separately most of their married life, and in fact, he disinherited her. He left all of his money to Paul, and Paul and Hortense outlived Cezanne, and Paul eventually reached a settlement with his mother and gave her part of the fortune, but she squandered it all away in Paris gambling, and he gave her no more money. It was also at this time, 1886, that Zola published a novel about a failed painter who committed suicide. By this stage, by the way, Zola was a wealthy and very sophisticated and successful writer who saw Cezanne as a failure. As I said, at this stage of his life, he was rejected by everybody. He'd sold a few, but he sold very few works. And Cezanne saw this as this novel Zola had written about the failed painter, being about himself, and their relationship cooled at this point. They did still occasionally write to each other, but they were no longer close friends. I said he needed many sittings to paint a portrait. This is Madame Cezanne in a yellow chair, a later painting. He's not interested in the personality of the sitter, but in the overall, what you might call formal characteristics, the balance, the composition, the colour, balancing the colour, balancing the composition. That doesn't mean accurate representation. You'll notice the dado rail behind her doesn't carry across on the left side of the picture. It's a different height from the right side of the picture. But he's balancing the picture. And he's capturing a moment which you could regard as timeless. Pablo Picasso said later, "There is no past or present in art. If a work cannot live always in the present, it must not be considered at all." Well, by this stage, Cezanne was living increasingly in Aix and worked in a studio at the top of the house. Renoir visited him, so he wasn't alone. I don't mean he was a sort of solitary, isolated figure. He still had friends. They worked together in the studio, but he didn't make any new friends. One reason was 3 years previously, he'd contracted diabetes, which made it harder for him. It was painful. It made it harder for him to deal with new people, to get to know people. We're now beginning to enter his mature period, 1890 to his death in 1906. So we've been through what's called his mature period, and we're into his final, sometimes called late, sometimes called lyrical period. And what I've done is I've combined the two periods, final and mature, and divided them in by subject. So I'm going to show you some portraits, then some still lifes, then Mont Saint Victoire, and then Bathers, about 3 of each. This is a boy in a red vest. In fact, this is a model. Remember, he was now wealthy and could afford to hire professional models to pose. And we know who it is. It's a boy called Michelangelo di Rosa. And he painted three other portraits of the same boy in a red waistcoat. And these paintings are now around the world in New York, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Zurich. And it's the Zurich painting that I showed you is perhaps the most famous. It was actually stolen in 2008, but it was recovered 4 years later. It was valued at the time at $91 million, the most valuable painting in the Zurich Museum. Described by the curator of the museum as a perfect balance of high compositional intelligence and spontaneous, painterly intuition. The other painting he painted at this period, which became the third most expensive painting of all time when it was bought by the royal family of Qatar in 2011. We don't know the exact price, but it's somewhere between $250 million and $300 million. Now, at this time, the 1890s, he became increasingly interested in painting people and completed a complete series of works on the card players. I'll show you the series in a moment. They're all using a restrained palette, have flattened forms, a geometric composition, and they're considered some of his most important work. He was adopting a theme by 17th century Dutch and French artists of people playing card games, normally shown as drunk and rowdy, but not in Cezanne, sombre, stony-faced, serious, Provençal card players we have here. You might have seen this elsewhere because it's in Pennsylvania, top left, Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, bottom left. The one in the bottom middle is Courtauld, and bottom right, the Musée d'Orsay. Now, they vary in size. Roughly, they go across the top and along the bottom in date. We don't know the exact dates and size. The largest is in Philadelphia, and we believe that is the one he painted first. And they're gradually simplified, and the paintings get smaller, and we close in on what's important about the subject. The smallest, most constrained, most closely cropped, and probably the one he painted last is the one in Musée d'Orsay at the bottom right. Another still life. He rarely painted flowers, by the way, because he took so long to paint them, they often wilted before he'd finished. He sometimes painted potted plants, as we see here, but his principal interest was fruit, and particularly the apple. In fact, there's a well-known statement he made: "I should like to astonish Paris with an apple." What did he mean by that? He intended to astonish, I think, because he said, another quote I've got here, "Painting from nature does not mean copying the object. It means realizing its sensations." So what he's doing here is he's not, don't expect realistic apples, although he always painted realistically. Expect an apple that conveys his feelings about apples. And remember, apples, well, they last well, they don't wilt like flowers, but they have religious overtones, connotations. He wanted to simplify things, bring them down to their basics, their geometric essentials. This is still life with apples and a pot of primroses, and an example of the still lifes he was painting at this stage. Another still life of apples, a bit more dynamic. The apples in the basket look as though they're tilting over. They're almost sculptural. Here they're simplified further. There's different coloured apples. The apples are balanced in terms of their shapes and positions and colour. He once said, art is a harmony running parallel to nature, not an imitation of nature, a harmony running parallel to nature. His quest was to find the underlying structure of the composition. Remember, he said painting from nature is not copying the object, it's realising one's sensation. In this still life with apples, he's achieved that with, and notice also the intentional failure to create the right perspective for the top of the vase on the left. The way that the bottle has reached the top of the painting, but he's balanced the two sides of the painting, either side of the bottle, and he's balanced the apples either side of the vase at the front of the table. It's a quote, not from Cezanne, from another French artist. Of an ordinary painter's apple, you say, I could take a bite out of it. Of an apple by Cezanne, one says, how beautiful. And this painting, I think, Still Life with Plaster Cupid, brings a lot of his ideas together. It's a painter's painting of still life. I'll explain why. In the back, this is in the foreground. The Cupid is a cast of a Baroque sculptor called Pierre Puget, and it's his Cupid. In the background is another of his works, The Flayed Man, but in this case, it's a painting of the flayed man, or of course, it's a painting of a painting, because we're looking at a painting. Well, in fact, you're looking at a reproduction of a painting of the flayed man. The perspective is intentionally distorted, and that is made obvious by the tilted floor, tilted in two directions. The furthest apple, which is too large for its distance, although it's difficult to tell its different distance because it's difficult to tell what's going on. And then over on the left there, on the table, there's an onion on this side of the table and an onion the other side of the table. But the onion the other side is cut off by the edge of this painting here, but it's continued in the painting. So we have a painting, this painting, still life painting, has a still life painting within it of what looks like apples with a blue cloth, but the blue cloth at the edge of the painting just runs straight into the blue cloth on this table here, and it's difficult to know whether this blue cloth is rising up from this table or is part of this painting, which also contains a blue cloth. So in other words, it's a complex late still life where he's you could say playing with ideas about the nature of representation. It's well balanced as a composition, but in terms of the naturalness, there's an artificiality. It's essentially a comment on the act of painting itself. Switching to his Mont Saint Victoire, This was a mountain near his hometown, near Aix. It's not particularly high mountain, but it's a mountain that is figures in legends in Aix. So it's a well-known painting of Aix, and he painted it repeatedly throughout his career. I think more than 30 oil paintings and 45 watercolours. In fact, I found, not in exactly the same place, but I found a photograph of the mountain. So you can see again, representationally, it's fairly accurate as a representation. This is painted, the painting is from a slightly different place from the photograph, but you can see it's a fairly accurate representation of the mountain. But in terms of his representation of the countryside, it's made up of a series of strokes of paint that you can see and that you're intended to see. It breaks up the painting. The painting's held together by this tree trunk on the left and this overarching branch above it, which encircles the mountain, a technique he used in other paintings. And there's contrasting and balanced colours in the painting. I'll explore that a bit more in a moment. It's a timeless scene, a timeless landscape, although there is a modern introduction here of a railway, a viaduct with what I think is a train above it, with the smoke of a train. When it was exhibited in Aix and met with incomprehension. One of the few paintings, you'll notice bottom right, one of the few paintings he signed. He signed very few paintings and dated very few. I should have said at the beginning, the dates that I've taken are from the art historian's analysis of all the paintings most likely date. This is a quarry at Bibimus, a quarry near Aix. In fact, you can walk, I think it's about 5 kilometres from Aix. Believed to be the first of the paintings of the quarry. He painted a number, but he's made the quarry come alive somehow. To me, it looks like some herd of prehistoric animals marching across the painting. I think that's partly because you can't see the ground at the bottom of the painting, partly because he's brought these forms to life with the colour. This painting, incidentally, was bought shortly before he died by a dealer, Ambroise Vollard, and Vollard had bought about 150 works that Cezanne sent him, and partly because of Vollard's exhibiting the paintings, prices started to rise for Cezanne's work, and in fact rose 100-fold. Vollard made a big profit from the increase. And also around about this time, a couple of years before he painted this, he sold his first painting to a museum, the Berlin National Gallery. And it's also that year his mother died, and at his sister's insistence, he sold the Jardin de Buffon and moved into a small city apartment where he had a studio. And he bought some land a bit later and built a studio in 1901. The studio, I'll mention later, is open to the public now. Right, I wanted to show you this. We don't know whether it's a finished painting, but it does give you, if it is unfinished, it gives you a very good idea of the technique that he used. I believe that it is unfinished. He said, nature is not on the surface, it's in the depths. Colours are the surface expression of this depth. They grow up from the roots of the world. They are its life, the life of ideas. Now, if you take a bit of this painting that's where you can see bare canvas, just take this bit here and think to yourself, what colour would you paint it? Put yourself in the position of Cezanne. Would you paint it a dark colour? The dark colour would balance these darks. There's a lot of darks over here. Maybe there's too many darks up here. Then you should put some lights to balance the lights here and balance in with join these light colours here. There should be more light colours up here. Or maybe more dark colour here to join in with the dark colours here to give you a line across of darks, balancing the light colours below here. And should the bottom of the painting be filled in with lighter colours or darker colours? These perhaps are the thoughts that went through Cezanne's mind, and it's why he took so long to put in one dab of colour, this thought process in creating a balanced composition, balanced tones, the darkness of the colour, balanced hues, the colour itself, to create something that will live forever in the museums. I've got a quote from Émile Bernard describing his way of working. He began with the shadow parts and with one spot on which he put a second larger one, then a third, until all these shades covering each other modelled the object with their colouring. It was then that I realised that a law of harmony was guiding his work, and that all these modulations had a direction preordained in his mind. The Bathers, the last of the series I'm talking about. Beginning of his late period, this was produced. This is the one in the Musée d'Orsay. Maybe the figure with a towel is based on another old master, Signorelli. Luca Signorelli figures in a landscape. Was one of the influences on Cezanne. He did, as I say, copy from old masters, from his old sketches to create these. He never mixed male bathers and female bathers in the same painting. I believe he was trying to avoid any sexual overtones with his naked bathers. He didn't want those associations, but he did want the naturalness of the naked body in natural surroundings. Another painting of an old master, Poussin, just to show you what the sort of sexual connotations that he was trying to avoid. In this Poussin, Nymphs with Satires, but Poussin wasn't trying to avoid sexual associations, but was justifying it, if you like, by painting it as a mythological subject. That's not what Cezanne was doing. Another of his bathers, this one in the National Gallery in London, called The Bathers. One of the paintings he pictured of female bathers in the final 10 years of his life. A lot of people say that he was working outside the classical tradition because we never see nudes in this way. In fact, I wanted to show you a work that might have influenced him by, we don't know whether it's by Giorgione or Titian. We think Titian probably finished it after Giorgione's death. But the point I wanted to make is that we have female figures in a landscape like with dressed men, and which in fact refers back to the Manet, and Manet was no doubt had this painting in mind, and it gives the lie to critics at the time who said to Manet, there are no old master paintings which have naked women and clothed men in them. But coming back to the Cezanne. Again, reminding you, I want to make of Impressionism something solid and lasting, like the art in the museums, So what he's creating here is a very strong composition, solid figures, unifying colour palette. Now regarded as one of his great masterpieces, derided in his hometown. They of course celebrate him now in Aix. He's the number one way they sell the town. But at the time there was an auction of Cezanne's painting in 1903, and it resulted in laughing fits amongst the bourgeoisie of Aix. There was an essay produced, a critical essay in a newspaper called Love for the Ugly, and that resulted in Cezanne receiving threatening messages from other people in Aix. They left the messages on his doorstep accusing him of dishonouring the town and telling him to leave the town immediately. In 1903, Zola died, leaving him, although, as I said, they had semi-broken up, it still left Cezanne profoundly depressed when he died. His health deteriorated further. He distrusted other people to the point of delusions of persecution. He started to receive these letters saying he was dishonouring the town, which made him feel more depressed. This is one of his large bathers in Philadelphia, one of his most ambitious works, created in the final years of his life. It's several female nude figures, a strong composition. He no longer used female models, of course. He didn't intend to create realistic naked women bathers, so he didn't need female models anyway. And this painting is considered one of the great masterpieces of modern art. He worked on it for 7 years, and it's believed it's unfinished at his death. Now, this is Mont Saint-Victoire, but the reason I'm putting it up is one day in 1906, he was caught in a storm while painting Mont Saint-Victoire. He carried on painting for 2 hours in the pouring rain until he was taken home. He was taken back to his house. Remember, I said he had bought an apartment in the middle of Aix. It's still there. I've circled it in yellow. It's in a street in the middle of Aix. He was carried there in a passing carriage. The next day he felt a bit better. He got up and started painting and fainted. They called for help. He was put to bed again, but died a few days later on the 22nd of October. And remember, it was October. He was painting for 2 hours in the rain, so it was cold. He died of pneumonia, age 67. He was buried here in Saint-Pierre Cemetery in Aix, just outside of the city. In his will, as I said before, he excluded his wife Hortense and made his son the sole heir. If you visit Aix, be sure to visit his studio on Avenue Paul Cézanne, as they've called it now. Now they're proud of Cezanne. You can tour the studio, which is just as he left it. And then 15 minutes further up the road is a path that leads to a spot where he often painted Mont Saint-Victoire, so you can see the mountain from up there. That brings me to the end of this talk, one of my longest talks. Sorry about taking so long. Until the late 1890s, his work continued to provoke incomprehension and public ridicule. He was full of self-doubt his whole life, but he refused. He was stubborn. He refused to make compromises. He was a loner and a bit of an oddball. He was regarded that way by Renoir, Monet, Pissarro, Degas. They were increasingly enthusiastic about his work. But as Pissarro said, it will be centuries before we get an account of it. So they thought it was art for the future rather than for today. As I said, the dealer Ambroise Vollard opened the first solo exhibition of his work in Paris, and that started to lead to an appreciation of his work. And one critic, I've got a quote here, one critic wrote, "He is a great truth fanatic, fiery and naive, harsh and nuanced. He will go to the Louvre." A profound critical response at the time. He began to be seen as a master by young artists who visited his studio in Aix. And shortly before he died, some of this was before in the last few years of his life, he started to be accepted by young artists, and he was exhibited internationally and began to be seen just before he died as one of the leading post-impressionists, along with Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin. That brings me to the end of the talk. Thank you for your attention and for your time. Bye.